Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Smiley Poswolsky. I am an author and a speaker and the author of a book called Friendship in the Age of Loneliness. And I'm very excited to talk today to two incredible entrepreneurs and friends of mine, Ben Proven and Jay Standish, the founders of OpenDoor Coliving, two real pioneers in the co-living community housing movement. I got to live in one of their houses for several years in Oakland, California, and they recently shut down the company. And we all thought this was an incredible opportunity for Jay and Ben to share the story of OpenDoor, lessons learned, why they started a co-living company, what they got out of it, what the residents got out of it, lessons in real estate and building a movement around people spending more time together and living together, and what that looks like and how hard it is sometimes. As they go on to incredible other opportunities. This was kind of a great moment for us to have this conversation. So some stats about OpenDoor, just to set the picture of how much of a scale this company really had. At its height, OpenDoor operated over 400 units, including 19 properties in 3 states across the United States. They raised $6 million of capital and had $70 million in asset value. And they were operating with $5.1 million in real estate capital over 10 years and employed 12 full-time staff. So before we get into kind of the details about what OpenDoor is, I want Jay and Ben to kind of take us back to their origin story. How did you two meet?
Jay and I actually met in a MBA program at the time called Bainbridge Graduate Institute. And it's a 2-year program entirely focused on sustainability, social impact, essentially using business as a tool to achieve your vision or make the kind of difference you wanted to make in the world. And we met really just as friends. And through that, we early on discovered we both had a passion for community and both had personal experiences in the past through our travels, primarily living in community, volunteering in community, both rural and suburban type, co-housing, eco-villages, kind of the more 1.0 models in a way that are amazing and fantastic and things that we learned from. But something we wanted to build off of as we hope to kind of scale an idea and a vision around community.
Jay, anything to add there?
Yeah, or maybe just add to the next step of the story. We met in grad school and eventually found out about this project in San Francisco that was creating what they called a co-living house called the Embassy. And we reached out to them and said, hey, we think what you're doing is cool. And it seemed like this different flavor on community living that wasn't just about kind of hippie granola Berkeley vibes, but so we ended up sort of doing it as a grad school project in our last year of our MBA program, and that resulted in basically saying well, why don't we start our own house? And I remember being we don't really know what we're doing. We're finishing grad school, we don't know what we're doing next, and why don't we all just get a big house together in the Bay Area and see where it goes? And I think Ben and I definitely had the idea of starting a company out of it. That was the intention. And we're definitely going after that. And we had an early investor, was an architect who kind of backed us a very tiny amount, $1,000 a month each, I think, for a few months. That gave me the confidence to pack all my stuff in a U-Haul and move to the Bay Area. And I knew maybe my rent was paid for, but nothing else. And so really out of starting that house, which was called the Sandbox House, that was the prototype for what then became OpenDoor. And so we kind of learned how to do community by living it ourselves. And in some ways that house was the headquarters of, the birthing of OpenDoor.
And how many people were living there? What year are we in? And, kind of also for people that might not understand as much, kind of define the terms a little bit for us, kind of co-living, co-housing. I think a lot of people maybe associate it with a co-op on a college campus, but what does it mean to you?
Sure.
I would offer that to you.
I think starting with, if you know what a co-op on a college campus is, it's not a bad starting point. I think co-living, as it is distinguished from some other forms of community housing. Co-housing, people know about that. By and large, it's more suburban, in some cases rural. It's hard to do it in a dense urban area. So a lot of times people go out into the burbs and buy tract of land and split it up. And it's also an ownership model. So people are owning their homes and there's a common house and common facilities or common landscaping, what have you. So it's an awesome model, but it's not co-living. And one of the reasons we decided not to pursue co-housing ourselves was because we were really passionate about sustainability and want to do something that could be more urban, more connected to the urban core and not necessarily sprawling out. And I do think that is one of the defining features of co-living, at least how we were defining it and creating it, was as an urban community living product. And as a result, it tended to be more like bedroom rentals because it's hard to create these multi-unit properties in the way that you want to. And then also I think the other way I would define it is it's very much centered on young professionals, not exclusively, but more just stage of life. It tends to attract people who are, graduated from college, or if they didn't go to college, kind of in the beginning to middle of their career, but they don't have families. They don't necessarily need a larger space all themselves. So the huge majority of people that have ever lived in our homes were kind of, early 20s to mid 30s. And I think as a result, it just was, I think that there's a flavor of the culture there of people kind of young and upwardly mobile in their career. But then the other aspect of it being urban, I think Jay referenced he had co-founded a co-working space. And I think we were really inspired by that world and those values, which, it was people working, it was people creating, it was freelancers, it was entrepreneurs. And at the same time, valuing collaboration, valuing close relationships and wanting that, I think at the time, kind of as millennials were defining themselves as a generation, I think those are some of the values that were very central to who millennials are and how they kind of wanted to make the world in their vision and their values. And so we wanted to be almost the pinnacle of what that could be, of a tightly collaborative, connected, creative type culture in our home. So I think that was very fundamental to us, but I would say it's shared broadly with a lot of other co-living communities.
And kind of take me kind of a little bit back in terms of kind of how we get from Sandbox and then move forward. What does that process look like? How many people were living at Sandbox, and how kind of did you say, all right, let's build this, let's grow this, let's build this to more homes?
Sure. So I think Sandbox was 8 bedrooms, if I remember correctly. I think there was one couple, so I think we maybe had 9 people in the house, and I feel like we had early momentum. It was definitely felt like something was happening, and there were people coming over for dinner, and we're meeting all sorts of new people in the Bay Area. I mean, Ben and I both were new to the Bay Area at this time, and just saying yes to every meeting and every coffee and every event was a very extroverted time. And through that process, I mean, we were definitely looking for other properties to do co-living in. And we're collaborating with Jesse Kate from the embassy a little bit in those early days. And we eventually got in touch with a woman who owned a 16-bedroom Victorian in Berkeley that she was renovating specifically to be a community house. It's what else do you do with a 16-bedroom, huge, 5,500 square foot old home, but rented out to a big group of people. And she had a few self-organized groups that were trying to form and had fallen through and didn't really get their ethos together and weren't able to collaborate effectively to be able to kind of feel like a solid group that could take the community on. And so we had already, run this one house ourselves, and Jessie was involved. And so she had started Embassy. And so it felt like there were these 2 cases of houses that we had started, and we had enough traction that she felt comfortable master leasing the property to us as a company, to sort of feel like we had the long-term continuity, and that we would hold the community together and also be a professional organization that she could collaborate and partner with. And so that was our second project. And we'll probably get to this later, but we master leased it for a fixed amount of money, and sort of as a company took risk on being able to fill the rooms and have no vacancy and not lose money. And in the early days, we were also doing a guest program. So we had a couple of rooms that were rented out sort of by the night or by the week, and that generated a little bit extra revenue. Although most of that extra revenue was shared with the residents for like doing the booking and changing the sheets and stuff like that. So we didn't really have much positive cash flow on that first project ever, but it was an incredible learning opportunity, and we found a group of people that were like sort of the core founding members and collaborated really deeply with them to launch the community and find other residents and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting part of the before we get to kind of the business model, but that you had community, kind of this community driven leadership model, which I thought was really interesting. I remember one of the first times I ever heard about Open Door was through the farmhouse and kind of meeting one of the house catalysts, I believe is what you called them, community catalysts. Can you walk us through kind of how you thought that would be a good idea and how that took off? Kind of, you all are Open Door. Yes, you have this kind of umbrella organization, you're helping the catalyst, but they really set the culture, set the tone, that unique culture for that house. Talk us through that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this is also a great kind of connective point between the sandbox house and the farmhouse, where the sandbox house was in some ways our own product development, using ourselves as the customer, where we didn't have this term at the time, but we were the catalyst. We were the ones entrepreneuring the house. We were bringing people in. We created the website. We helped facilitate the conversations with residents to make decisions together and come up with systems around how do we do chores, how do we do food, that kind of thing. And so we were just figuring it out with ourselves as the customer, which I'll add is not just because we thought that was a great way to do product development, because we actually really wanted this, but I think we very deeply believed in the community values and experience. And so it was, I think, having ourselves as like a power user, customer, was an incredible learning early on. So then when we set out to do the farmhouse, we talked a lot about how do we sort of replicate that, but where we're not the ones doing it. Because I would say one of the fundamental, axioms of the community building model for us was that we could never create community for other people. They have to create it for themselves. And so we saw ourselves as facilitators that, maybe brought people in and gave them some tools, but ultimately they had to have a really deep sense of ownership for it to be a community versus, say, just a bunch of people renting rooms and kind of living together somewhat haphazardly. So through that, we came up with this idea of community catalysts, and the basic premise, I mean, you explained it perfectly, Smiley, was that they were the ones that are going to create the community and we were going to support them. And so what was really interesting at Farmhouse is we started with a couple, Chris Hujaworth and Gina Giarmo, who we had met through the Sandbox House. So it was very kind of organic growth there. We weren't reaching outside of our networks. But then pretty quickly in working with them to create a vision for the community, a number of other early kind of co-founders of that house came in, like Megan Lipset, Hans, I forget, there's one other, Jay, was it Evan?
Yeah,
Evan. So anyway, so there's this crew that then really in some ways ran with it. I mean, we were helpful, but it hit a point where it kind of felt like they had their own momentum. They had their own sense of kind of a center of gravity, if you will. And it worked so well that we said, this is our model. Like, this is incredible how this worked. And we used for most of the houses subsequently, and we'll get to some of that later and where that model did start to break down. But I think that was a huge success and a huge learning for us, and ultimately how to scale culture, because that, another, I would say, sort of kind of angle on this is that we had this housing model, and as you referenced, we'll talk about the business model, but it was ultimately a sort of community and cultural experience. And so there's always this tension there around scaling the business and the housing model and the real estate model, and scaling a culture and scaling a community and a network. And when things worked well, those were in sync. And there's times when those values clashed. And that was, I'd say, probably the main tension in the company as we grew, how to balance those kind of two components.
I think the other, interesting feature, in addition to each kind of Open Door house having its unique culture, is they're all very nicely designed on the interior. You move in, there's beautiful furniture. It feels like it's lived in. There's an espresso machine. Like it's not just, as you put it, kind of the hippie ramshackle college home. Talk about kind of the vision there and how you kind of made that happen so that when people come into the space, as both as residents and as guests, actually, it feels really well lived in and a kind of a comfortable, lively place to be, creative even place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it all starts with like, what would you want for yourself? And so it's like, yeah, I'd love to live in an awesome home and have nice furniture and cool design and interesting people around and dinners and events happening. And so it's just sort of the full gamut of how that comes into place. And so it's also just like inspiring to find new residents. They're like, oh, this is an awesome house. Like, I want to live here. Like, this is great. It's not like, oh, I guess it'd be cool. The community part's a pro, but like the physical space, you want both, you want to win on both. And so part of the premise also economically was get more through sharing. That like you're paying rent based on a bedroom, not an entire apartment. And that by sharing even a larger house than you might share, like if you could have normal roommates, you have 1, 2, 3 roommates, maybe sharing like a normal single family home. But we're talking about, 8 to 15 bedroom houses. In the early days, they were actually houses. Later on, we'll get to like the micro apartments and the larger scale properties. But there's just an intention there to have it be a beautiful space. And as we got into custom design and new construction later on in the story, a lot of it not only was like, hey, let's have nice furniture and a fully stocked kitchen with Vitamix and all that kind of stuff. It was also, the actual floor plan and layout of the building. And, is there a den nook that you can hang out in with 3 people and have an intimate conversation while there's like a salon dinner happening with 25 people in the like open plan living, dining, kitchen space. And so, by living in these communities ourselves for, 5 to 7 years between the two, each of us, you learn a lot about the day-to-day lifestyle and then just incorporating that in. And as we did new projects, you learn more and like what worked in farmhouse, what didn't work. It ended up being basically 20 people in a 3-story, 16-bedroom house. And there was one main, big, amazing kitchen and like sort of a wet bar in another part. But in like later houses, there are multiple, like a secondary kitchen and things like that informed the design as we started doing custom buildings.
If I can add one thing to that,
please.
I think that everything Jay's sharing around sort of the quality of the space kind of gets at maybe one of the defining features of how we wanted to create co-living, and that we didn't see it as some, slightly cheaper, lower quality way to like bring down the housing costs for people. We really saw that, like, for us, it was actually a preferred lifestyle. And for the people that particularly in the early days came in, it was that, there's a lot of people that could easily afford their own apartment or something more expensive or something nicer. And so it was people choosing this lifestyle, because they wanted community. They wanted that experience of being connected to people, of having at your fingertips, this sort of social network to create events and do dinners and go skiing and all that. And I think also around the furnishings and interior design, everything Jay was saying, we wanted to actually feel like more, not less, and certainly not even the same. And that's the power of sharing. So I think there's this other thread there around, when we started the company was very much at the part of the sharing economy when things were starting to really take off, and Airbnb was becoming more mainstream, and Uber and Lyft, and it was a really exciting time in that respect. And I think we got inspired a lot by what those companies were doing in a very specific vertical of like, mobility or, hotel or hospitality type rentals. We saw ours as a more holistic model where, hey, there's all of these things we can share. We can have really nice stuff if we buy like high-end kitchen equipment and really dope couches from, West Elm and a projector that comes down from the ceiling, that kind of thing. So, I think it was this idea that the shared economy you could get more for less, as Jay said, but in a really I think in a potent way that comes together in a home and in a community that ultimately I think was a huge driver to why things grew so quickly and we got a lot of press attention early on.
Yeah, talk to me about some of that press. I remember you had a feature, I think it was with NBC and maybe some other news outlets of kind of people featuring. What did that feel like, and how did that come about?
Yeah, we definitely got early press. I remember we had a CNN video spot done on us when it was still just the Sandbox House, I think. Maybe we had gotten started with planning the farmhouse by then, but and then especially in the first like 5 years, 3 to 5 years, we ended up being kind of the longest running co-living company, at least in the US. And there's another group called Campus that was a proper company that started before us. Embassy is like in between a company and a group of friends. But it wasn't until maybe 4 years after we started that there started to be like venture-backed co-living companies and some other brands and operators that were trying to do it. So in some ways we were kind of on the vanguard of pioneering the concept. And so I think people kind of took to that, even though in some ways you could say, well, people have been living with roommates forever. Everybody's lived in a dorm, like you got senior housing, there's co-housing, all this other stuff that sort of happened before. But I think to some degree, like each generation has to discover something for themselves and make their own version of it that, maybe weaves in other concepts that are at the forefront of the zeitgeist at that time. So yeah, it's sort of like press article leads to press article, and there'd usually be like a thrush where like, the Atlantic would do something and then a couple other press article outlets would see that and do like a copycat article, and more or less do the same concept. And so you'd have like 3 articles at a time. But yeah, we've been in all sorts of stuff. Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Shareable.
They did we were the
LA
cover
Times.
of Christian Science Monitor.
Yeah, print cover,
Whoa.
Christian Science Monitor, LA Times, The Guardian, CNN,
NBC Marketplace.
NPR multiple times, on the radio.
Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
NPR.
my mom like,
Sorry,
my
NBC.
mom's on the radio, or my son's on the radio.
Yeah, I got a bunch of calls anytime it was NPR. That's where my community was like, I heard you on NPR. I would say one thing to add to what Jay's saying is early on, it wasn't an article as much on OpenDoor as it was on Co-living, and we were the company doing it. So I think the first 2 years, a lot of the press was honestly just popularizing the concept, and kind of almost like this conversation here, right? Like helping educate people what it's all about and debunk some of the, I think, assumptions people have. And but through that, obviously got a lot of attention on us as a company. And I actually think it was exciting because we authentically felt we were helping build a movement, and then we were getting attention as a result of that, but in service of something greater. And I think it was exciting. It was motivating. I think it helped get our business off the ground, helped credentialize us in ways we would never have otherwise been able to kind of go to investors and VCs and be able to kind of show that we're like a real thing. Because, at the end of the day, like we just had like a couple houses in the East Bay,
Right.
I think it gave us a lot more street cred.
Yeah. And also like Ben and I don't personally come from, money. And so we were bootstrapping all of this. And actually, the first 2 investors, Stoney and Eric, both came through press articles. They're like, hey, I read about you guys and whatever it was. And like, I'm in the Bay. Can we come and visit your property? And then, got to know them and become friends, and ended up investing early days. But that wasn't until we had done 3 properties, including the Sandbox House. We started the Sandbox House, the farmhouse, and then we partnered with a family office, which is sort of like a professional investing group for a wealthy family, and ended up doing like 4 projects with them. But the first one was still is called Euclid Manor. And again, all these properties and communities still exist. They're still communities. People, there was a smooth handoff. We'll get to that later. But we bootstrapped it somehow. I think magical financial things happened allowed Ben and I to somehow pay ourselves.
They're
I remember
not that magical. It's called not paying yourself.
Yeah, it's fun
years.
saying yourself. But living in the Bay Area while like the tech boom is happening and rents are like the highest they are in the country, we definitely pulled a rabbit out of the hat a little bit. But you learn a lot. I think it is important to be scrappy and actually make things stand on their own, and also put your hands on the actual gears and machines and know how to operate things yourself and be, not only have we done every job in the company, we've also lived the entire experience, probably more than any of our residents for the most part. There's a couple, actually, Brent has lived in OpenDoor longer than we have personally.
Brent Shilcon, yeah.
Yeah, and Molly Gore also is like about the same tenure, like 5+ years, but yeah, we really lived the life. So.
I mean, speaking of which, Ben, you and your partner raised your family. You've raised a child in an
not quite
OpenDoor home.
Not quite. Justin Jolene.
Oh, Justin Jolene. Okay, sorry, Justin and Jolene did. Sorry, I thought you and Sarah as well.
We moved out about a year before.
Okay, sorry.
Which we didn't quite have the courage to have a child in the Euclid Manor, and we were very common in terms of. One of the main reasons people left was they basically, I would always call it graduated, but, started a family or with partners and kind of wanted their own space. There's plenty of couples in our property, so it's not like the truth that being a couple, you can't live in community. But for a lot, I think at that point you start individuating a little bit. So,
right.
So yeah, we sort of fit a trend there. But I do miss.
But you lived with a child. There was a child living in the house. You and Jay, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So about a year.
Yeah, there's another kiddo, and at least in Euclid Manor. I'm not sure about any other properties. I think so, but maybe. Yeah.
It seems like it's beneficial for both. I mean, I know it's a complicated topic, but it seems like it's been beneficial for both that family, those parents, and the residents who also get to experience being around.
If people are into it, Euclid Manor, people bought into that. I think there are other homes that the community skewed a lot younger, and I think it probably they're just like more about going out and partying and being social, and like kid could feel more like an anchor. But Euclid Manor, being a bit on the older side, really embraced it. I mean, I think it was, as you said, mutually beneficial for all involved, and grounding too. I think as you start to get in your 30s, and I know for Sarah and I personally, thinking about having kids, having a family so close, and being able to kind of observe, like we don't have that now. We used to, at least so they say, we used to all be more intergenerational, but just being able to like see how someone chooses to raise their kid, and the realities of like things like breastfeeding and sleeping being hard and all that kind of stuff. That was really valuable for us.
Let's turn to the financials here, because I think that's something that kind of probably trips a lot of people up when they even just think about co-living, or if people that want to start their own co-living communities, the numbers game becomes quite complicated. Real estate's, I mean, it's hard enough to just buy one house or thinking about leasing one property, let alone multiple ones. And I know that you all had kind of an interesting business model that wasn't actually the same necessarily for all of the properties. So I'm curious if you can give a little bit of an overview of how you went about that, and in terms of the investment and kind of how your partners and how you thought about that. And if you want to break it down for a couple of the properties, or however you want to approach that.
Sure. Yeah.
Jay, Ben, you want to start, and then Jay?
Yeah, and I can do some structures, Jay. We can kind of divide and conquer. But I would say one fundamental premise to understand before going to specific structures is, I would say, the kind of underlying economics of co-living. And fundamentally, what you're doing is by creating these homes or apartments with a lot more bedrooms, you're essentially increasing density, meaning the number of people living per square foot is a simple way to think of it. And by doing that, you're then able to charge less per bedroom than if you split that up into, say, individual studios. And they're also able to make more money in total on the real estate side. So there's sort of this value creation there. This is identical for co-working, for anyone who knows co-working, that by sharing, you're unlocking this value where people, they have their own maybe little smaller bedroom, 120, 150 square feet, when maybe they have a 500 square foot studio, but then they're sharing 1,000 square feet or 800 square feet of common area. So you have a small bedroom, but more overall space that's just being shared. And so essentially different deal structures kind of slice and dice that value creation in different ways between three parties. The tenant, OpenDoor as sort of the manager or operator, and then the owner or investor. So I think that's, maybe keep that in mind as we go through different deal structures. The way we started, as Jay mentioned, was with the master lease structure, which is the purpose of that. I mean, in simplest terms, it's we as OpenDoor guaranteed per month a certain amount of rent to the landlord, and then we collected rent from all the residents, and then we made a margin between what we collected and what we paid. Very simple. The point of doing it that way is to de-risk the owner or the landlord. Essentially, they're like, I don't care if this thing's like going gangbusters, if it's like you got a bunch of rooms vacant, I get my check every month. The downside of that is, of course, that on when things aren't going so well, OpenDoor would have to eat, essentially lose money. But early on, that was the way I believe every co-living company started, including ourselves, because how do you convince a landlord who like this new thing called co-living, and you're not necessarily a big company yet. Even the venture-backed companies did master leases for a while.
Definitely.
It's easier to scale. You don't have to, like, landlords just don't have to care about your business. They're like, you just sent me a check. So,
and actually, I'll just pick up there because that was also WeWork's model on the co-working side was, you guys don't have to believe in our occupancy numbers and all that. We're just going to straight up master lease this as a company from you as an owner. And WeWork's model also was like, we're going to kind of overpay. Like we're happy to, and every owner was like, awesome, you guys are going to come in and pay all this money. And they're like, cool, we're going to just raise all this crazy amount of venture money so that we just have like, these huge coffers, and we're willing to overpay a little bit because they're trying to do the hockey stick growth and get to scale really fast. And so that was like, WeWork's whole model, and a lot of the other sort of phase 2 co-living companies that were venture backed to the similar model of like, we need to grow really fast to get to a large scale, which is obviously the venture model. And so putting that aside though a little bit, because that's the company financing, we at first were really focused on the real estate financing. Like, how do we even get these properties? So generally speaking, there's kind of like 3 deal structures or project types. I would say it's like the master lease, where you take risk as a renter. There's a buy an existing like turnkey property that's like ready to go, but you do have to figure out how to finance it and buy it. And then the third would be like new construction and development work, where either you're like massively renovating a project or you're building from the ground up. And so we did all 3 of those kinds of projects. In that order.
Right.
And
just to also, I want to separate 2 things out there because I think it's going to be a little confusing. There's deal structures, and then in terms of how you manage the properties, and then there's deal structures in terms of how you acquire, potentially renovate or build the properties. They're not totally independent, but they're somewhat distinct. So I think, Jay, what you're talking about is sort of like, okay, do we just master lease an existing one, renovate a property, or buy new? But then for any of those, we could do it through a master lease, or just to complete that trajectory, there's also property management, which is where we ended, which is essentially hiring a company like OpenDoor to manage the property. But instead of saying you have to guarantee this right, essentially, or guarantee this price, we share in the upside and downside, meaning we take 10% of all the rents collected, and that goes to us, and 90% goes to the owner. And that kind of is, you don't make as much money as a co-living company that way, but you take a lot less risk. So I think those are 2 important things to understand in terms of OpenDoor's business model, on top of then how do we acquire new properties, either ourselves or through partners. Totally. So there is some complexity there. I mean, there's a lot of essentially kind of moving parts that you need to find the right optimization for what's good for our company, what's good for growth, which obviously is good for our company, but at the same time, different structures would allow us to like raise more money, or attract different investor types or owner types. So,
were you ever approached by anyone that was like, let's bring this to 50 cities and do 3,000 units and something like that kind of thing?
We were the ones saying that. That's the pitch deck, right? Is like, we're building a national network of co-living spaces, and we got a third of the way there. We did the whole West Coast in a sense of, other than LA, we did all of the primary cities on the West Coast. We were in the Bay Area, Portland, and Seattle. And so, in general, the model, as we matured, I think we should start moving forward in time a little bit because we're still in the early days of the first couple of properties. It was very much around new development and new construction of properties that are designed specifically for co-living. And part of that, we actually just ran out of supply. Like there weren't any more easily accessible large Victorian mansions in the Bay Area for us to like gobble up. And I'm being a little bit facetious because there are obviously more houses, but like, it has to be in the right location, it has to be available, the pricing has to work, the space has to work. And we had learned a lot about what the layout needs to be and all those specifications. And so it just made more sense to increase the supply. And forever, OpenDoor was a supply constrained business, meaning that our growth was limited by how many properties do we have to be able to expand to. It was never, do we have enough residents to move into these houses? Later on, we had to build more of a marketing platform and do advertising and have like a CRM and professionally lease the properties because we were getting to a larger scale. But we were always looking for deals. That was the growth or the kind of sales and business development side of the company, was real estate acquisitions and development. And eventually,
which I would say is true broadly of urban real estate in expensive markets that are supply constrained. That's not unique to co-living. Rental housing in the Bay Area and Seattle and LA. It is if you build it, they will come model to some level. We were just a niche part of that in a way.
Yeah, totally. Are we answering your questions about deal structure? We could get a little bit more.
No, I think that's great. I think that's great. I just wanted to make sure that folks knew kind of the different models there.
Yeah, well, one final thing I'll say, I think that will help create a visual for people is OpenDoor at its core is an operating company that really you could think of as like a property manager. So by the end, all the properties that we had, other than a couple little caveats, but in general, we had property management contracts with owners of buildings. In some cases, we were also owners, but the ownership is a separate entity. So usually it's like an LLC that's created that owns the property, and then individual investors have shares in that LLC. And then usually there's a mortgage or some kind of debt that they're financing it with, so it's not 100% cash. And so as a property manager, you actually do the accounting for each of these entities in most cases, and kind of make sure there's revenue coming in and keep the property repaired and do all the day-to-day so that the investors can be essentially passive investors for the most part. And as we grew, we started partnering with larger and more professional developers and asset managers who had like full-time staff and partners who were doing investment work and development work. And so, we would have like a meeting of the minds with their asset management team around, doing the accounting and stuff like that. But some of the earlier projects, either we raised money ourselves from people in our network or partnered with smaller local property owners that might have 1, 2, 3 properties as like side investments, but weren't necessarily doing it full time.
I think this is a good time to kind of talk a little bit about the growth as you expanded to Portland and Seattle into these new markets and kind of built out a much larger team.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So there's 2 types of growth that we were pursuing at the same time. One was, as you said, just the number of properties under management, number of beds under management, number of markets we're in, just the obvious version of it. Maybe the less obvious version was the size of the properties. As Jay was saying before, we realized pretty early on we were supply constrained, as housing generally is in these markets, but it's specifically co-living. There's just not, if you want to grow at a certain rate, you need to start building product. And I think even one little footnote I'll put on that one is that we started this more about this sort of community lifestyle vision kind of idea and experience. We then realized we were actually solving a housing problem. not mutually, we're doing both at the same time, but it became clear that this was a creative, kind of aspirationally driven version of solving the housing crisis through creating these very intentional, values driven community homes that also were higher density and offering this more affordable price point compared to pretty much all the other new type of properties being built, compared to all the studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms that is mostly what is built and typically skews towards luxury and high end. We were trying to create something a bit more mid-market. So I think that's just an interesting, as we scale, that became more clear to us. And so, we were looking to scale into multiple markets, but also larger properties, both because, I said the main driver there in larger properties was economies of scale. And this is true co-living or any real estate product. It takes to do a property instead of a 10-bedroom mansion, do a 50-bedroom or 100-bedroom apartment building or co-living apartment building, maybe 2-3x the effort, right? You're really, there's a lot of things that are the same, whether they're small or big, in terms of raising money, putting the deals together. I mean, we've got to a point where we're trying to find investors. Certain investors say, I will only write a check as small as 3 million or as small as 5 million. You get into this sort of different problem than early on where you're trying to convince people, no, can you put in a little bit, put another 50K. So there's certain things that just scale more efficiently. And then, so with the scaling, that brought a whole slew of new things we needed to learn. One was how to do new construction. So instead of just repurposing existing properties, how to do new construction, partnering with developers, as Jay said, working a lot more closely with architects and cities to get things approved. So I sat in a number of city planning meetings with our development partners, trying to make the case for co-living. And that one, I learned a lot through that. I mean, the interesting thing is that the cities, by and large, are very supportive of this. They see this as a creative way to make more housing. Most people emotionally connect with the idea of community. I think mostly when people think about density, they're thinking about these large luxury condos or luxury apartment buildings. So this felt more maybe human, more, just the right way to do development. There was always some detractors, but generally we got a lot of support from the cities. And then where there were headwinds was honestly more some structural reasons around what you can and can't do within the code. As we're building new product, there's very few cities and states that have a code for community living. Sometimes there's group housing, not always, but no matter what, it's always a little bit fitting a round peg into a square hole. So that was something we learned, is how to kind of hack the code to be like, okay, like what if we put together 2 6-bedroom units and smush those together and they share the kitchen, and that feels like a 12-bedroom co-living community. So that was one of the things we learned along the way as we scaled. But I don't know, Jay, if you want to talk more else about just scaling, hiring multiple markets, all the kind of scale as we opened up Portland and Seattle, a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I mean, so we scaled to eventually Portland and Seattle, and where do we start? Well, part of also the economies of scale of doing larger projects, which we started to do in the last third of the company, is also a staffing planning issue, where if you do these little properties, it's like one 10-bedroom house cannot cover this full-time staff on our side, not even close. And so we would need to sort of know that we're going to have enough volume in one market to be able to support on-the-ground staff there, or at least one, if not multiple. And so, as we were expanding to new cities, we had to go, okay, if we're going to do this, we really need to commit to Portland and do a real estate pipeline, business development push to get enough deals coming online at the same time, such that, we're not losing too much money on staffing. Because we ran a pretty lean and mean organization, not mean, lean and kind organization in terms of, we raised capital from outside investors in the company, but these were practical people who, many of them with backgrounds in real estate, who kind of saw the potential of what we're doing. This was not a gamble VC kind of well, let's see what you guys can do. And fly too close to the sun and either you're going to flame out and die or be the biggest thing ever. We were actually trying to build a business that made sense and made money and was sustainable on its own legs. And it's part of why we were able to run for 10 years and only raise, a couple $1 million relative to some of the other co-living companies that had honestly pretty similar sized portfolios and raised like 10 times that much money. But to answer your question a little bit more clearly, like the on the ground staff we needed really for like leasing and like community building and operations, as well as repairs. So a lot of times we would do third party vendors for repairs, but as we had more properties in a given market, we would really prefer to have an in-house on our team maintenance and repairs coordinator who would do small repairs themselves as well as manage larger ones, and then a leasing and community building person, and then sort of a general, call them like assistant property manager on the ground, who's sort of a Jack, Jane, or person of all trades. And so Portland was a little more stepwise. Like we had smaller projects, and we were flying up there for a long period of time. We had no on the ground staff in Portland, and various people on our team from the Bay Area, which I think we were only 3 or 4 at that time, would fly back and forth to Portland and like, sleep on air mattresses in the building that was under construction. I remember making like ramen noodles out of like camping stoves in a bedroom in a house that had no heat in Portland in the winter.
The space heater in just that bedroom. I
yeah. Yeah, exactly. The space heater just in the bedroom. And like, so it was pretty humble stuff. I remember flying with my backpacking, Thermarest roll-up mattress and my sleeping bag, and like sleeping on a like dusty floor of a building for a week, because we didn't have budget to stay in hotels and stuff like that. And that was multiple years into the business. So we had a very humble, very scrappy, very like practical, we're not doing this for the glory kind of approach. And then in Seattle, we were definitely able to partner with some developers who had multiple larger properties that were that came online around the same time. And so that was a cleaner and, more by the book scaling model, in the sense that we had enough scale in Seattle around the same time to hire, I guess, 3 staff there. And like some of them were also doing global stuff, but like across the whole company. With a team of like 10, you're pretty diversified in terms of doing different stuff, but people generally will have like 2 or 3 different hats that they wear, where they're like, I'm both the Seattle leasing manager and OpenDoor's, sales manager, something like that. Or like global and local. So.
Ben, anything to add there?
I mean, I can share a little bit about some of maybe the kind of friction we began to experience with scaling. It wasn't all rainbows and butterflies. And this is true of any startup when they're scaling, but I think this gets back a little bit what I shared earlier around sort of this value creation and how that gets split by different parties with the tenants, OpenDoor, and the investors. As we got larger and we had more professional investors and owners, they were honestly a lot more aggressive in terms of the economics. There's just sort of a standard practice in real estate where, you increase rent X% per year, and, you need to hit certain numbers to satisfy your bank loan in terms of kind of the debt coverage ratio, things like that, and all things we had to learn along the way. It's probably worth noting as a footnote that Jay and I, neither of us came from a real estate background, so we learned an incredible amount on the job. We both had MBAs, but nothing specific in real estate. So I feel like we became, good enough to be dangerous and grow our business and learn quite a bit while still staying true to some of our more entrepreneurial and kind of impact-oriented roots. But footnote aside, at scale, these owners really pushed on rents, and I think it was harder to find more values-driven partners that were sort of bought into the impact thesis. And so a lot of them were coming at it from, hey, like, you can make me more money than if I just did a normal apartment building. That sounds awesome. So like, let's hammer on rents. And, I don't want to throw all owners in the same bucket. Some were easier, some were harder, but we had a lot of tension trying to kind of balance the needs of all the parties. And, I think co-living, we found there's a very inelastic pricing curve, essentially, where as you start to get closer with a co-living bedroom to a studio apartment, it becomes near impossible to lease, because people at some point start saying, you know what, why am I paying $1,600 for a bedroom in Oakland when I could pay $1,800 or $1,900 for a studio? So that was something that we ran into, but it took a long time. And for some owners, things just had to sit vacant for a while before they got it in their bones. But unfortunately, often they sort of pointed the finger at us. They're like, why aren't you promised me you could pull off this co-living thing? Why aren't these rooms filled? And I'm like, well, actually, it's kind of expensive. So I think that was a challenge as we scale to balance those needs. Though that being said, like our Seattle properties, the owners I thought were much more grounded in the price point, and that this is a sort of middle income product. And so when the owners were aligned, it was incredibly easy for these things to sort of fly off the shelves. So that was one, both kind of learning how to, interface intelligently with the real estate world, while still, when things were pushed too far, not only were rooms sitting vacant, but it could really hurt the community. I mean, one of the things Jay and I said early on is that the financial sort of economic system of co-living is a subset of the social system. In some ways, it's a microcosm of society, right? When you start to undermine your human capital and your social capital, your economy suffers. Yeah. So I think that was very real, where in a more practical kind of grounded sense, residents would start getting upset with why is pricing going up? Or people who had been long-term anchor tenants and anchor community members would start to leave. And so you'd have a lot more turnover. And then there was even this sense that OpenDoor being this kind of more aggressive landlord, and that was really hard for us, because we always saw ourselves as partners and close collaborators of the residents. As we said earlier, we saw ourselves as facilitators of community. And so when there wasn't goodwill in that relationship, that was some, for me personally, some of our toughest moments, both just operational headaches, but more importantly, feeling like there was tension with our core kind of values and mission as a company.
Yeah. I want to build off that a little bit, because this is a very nuanced, this ended up being the crux of the equation that we're trying to solve, and the challenge of growing the business and having it work out in the long term that we really got to. And it's a multifaceted thing that in some senses, Ben and I and a few other co-living operators might fully understand, but I'll try my best to explain it. And part of it starts with, how do you get a real estate deal to pencil? And we'll use the example of a new construction project, because that's kind of where everything was headed, and that was what we were doing toward the end. And as Ben said, investors and owners wanted to be a little more aggressive on rents, but that wasn't really coming from a place of they're oh, let's make this ridiculous return off people's backs. It was actually that, these are expensive cities, land is expensive, construction is incredibly expensive, materials have gotten incredibly expensive, and it's just very difficult to make deals pencil. And so a lot of times investors are looking to co-living because they're I can't get a normal apartment building to work in my financial model for this site. And if co-living can make just 1% more than regular housing, this deal might pencil, and we'll be able to do this. And so sometimes there was economic pressure from what needed to happen to make the deal work, that kind of twisted thing, and you take the edge off, and there's not quite enough common space. The bedrooms have to be a little bit smaller. And so we started, making we had to make some concessions and compromises in terms of what the physical product was, as well as the rents that we knew we had to hit to be able to have the economics of the project be viable. And so it's in the nuance of all those variables where we say, okay, well, the problem is you want more for less. we want to be able to get the rents that we would be able to get if this was an amazing house that had 1,000 square feet of common space and had $50,000 worth of beautiful furnishings in it and art and plants. But you want to do it with a $20,000 furniture budget and have the bedrooms be 30% smaller and have the common space be 50% smaller and in a neighborhood that's less desirable. And so
Right.
that was where, the nuance and the detail of that kind of logic it's a little hard to press on an investor who's in most cases are third parties. We did 2 deals ourselves where we raised capital and developed projects, but for the most part, we were a third party that was just advising on it and saying like, this is what I think we can do. And so in a lot of cases, we or in all cases, really, we turned the elbow grease and kind of made it happen. And, some of these projects were chronically had a little bit more vacancy and were hard to lease, and you end up having community problems because, it's just not the best experience for people. And I think, part of that is we're scaling and the 2 of us, our personal attention wasn't always on it. And, you're training a new group of team members who maybe haven't lived in community before. And it's a pretty rare thing that someone's like, hey, I've lived in community for 5 years and I'm good at operations and leasing. So that's sort of the overview on what's challenging about doing both the development, operations, and community all well and together.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. The kind of you're trying to meet the needs of 2 different people, 2 different groups. You sit in between,
let alone our own, right?
Yeah,
we were
and a lot of times,
middleman in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and we would definitely eat last in
right
in these circumstances, and that's we'll maybe get to that later, but yeah.
Let's talk about the impact of the pandemic and kind of how that shifted both challenges in terms of maybe filling the homes and also just capital drying up, rising interest rates, the impact on the housing market.
Yeah.
And how that affected the business.
I mean, to not put too fine a point on it, I do think COVID ultimately is what pushed us to the point of shutting down the business, but probably not for reasons that would be the obvious ones I think most people would think of. Certainly in the early days, there was the first 3-4 months in early 2020, there's a bit of a scramble to just figure out how do we help our communities kind of figure this out? We were all figuring it out, there weren't vaccines yet. If people travel and they come home, should they quarantine? Should they not? Just masks in the house. What happens if someone does get sick? That actually, I mean, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't a disaster. The communities were very intrinsically motivated there, and so we were just kind of being helpful where we can and sharing information between communities. And we did some things operationally, like halting cleaners for a while. In a lot of cases, we're able to convince the owners to keep paying, the cleaners or pay them a little bit. But so we didn't have people coming through the property as much. So there's kind of that piece. But honestly, I felt like we handled that as best as we could and kind of similar to how maybe a lot of other property managers and co-living companies did. I would say the sort of bigger impact once we were 6-12 months in was just the rental market was really tough. A lot of people early on had just been I'm moving in with my parents, or I lost my job. We had a bunch of people that were on work visas or international, and just overnight they lost their job and poof, they couldn't be in America anymore. So we had a huge amount of sort of vacancy and issues that again weren't unique to us as a co-living company, but we're just, there's at some point 20% vacancy in the Bay Area. And what that means, in terms of supply and demand and vacancy and how all that kind of interplays, ultimately there's just less demand. And so that showed up immediately as vacancy. And then over time, meaning we had to drop prices and give concessions and say, hey, we'll give you your first month or first 2 months free. And that again was all kind of standard operating practices. But what is unique to co-living and where that began to hurt us over time is for communities to function optimally, there needs to be some amount of ability to curate the residents around alignment, around, hey, are you a good fit? Do you want to be here? Do we want you to be here? Are you able to contribute in a way that's sort of commensurate with what we expect, et cetera? And we got it to a point where I think before the pandemic, it felt more often than not, we were on the same side of the table with our residents, kind of we want amazing people to live with our residents. They want amazing people to live with them. If we say no to this person here to give little time to find the right person, in a couple of weeks, that's great for everyone. The pandemic, it became more like different sides of the table a lot of times where we're like, we have 30% vacancy in this property. Like, if it gets any worse, our owner can't pay the mortgage. So we have to just fill rooms. And it was really hard because it was sometimes people weren't the best fit and maybe weren't as values aligned. And there was no silver bullet there, but the way that I think we ultimately handled that was transparency, just to say, hey guys, like, this is the reality. This is what's going on. Like, we don't want to just force people in, but if you want this community to be around in a year, this is kind of what we have to do. So I think that was definitely challenging and had a pretty long tail, because there's some communities that I feel like some communities thrive. So don't get me wrong, this is not like necessarily across the board. But some communities that didn't have as strong of a culture and kind of the sense of community ultimately devolved into more just individuals living together. And there was more like petty stuff of like people getting at each other's throats and us having to step in and facilitate conflict resolution more than we ever had. It was wearing on our team. Like, our team, I definitely remember many a call where people were like, God, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel like we're like doing the mission right now. So that was tough. And then, I maybe let Jay share a little bit more about some of the other impacts, but around, I think, that raising money became really hard.
Yeah.
I do want to circle back. I don't have to do now, but I do want to circle back on some of the issues around community we experienced between COVID and scale that I think is another kind of big time learning for like anyone who's thinking of co-living in 2023. I think there were some valuable learnings that came.
Yeah.
I can come back to that. So.
Yeah. Let's definitely deep dive on community dynamics, both positive and negative, maybe after this section or something. So yeah, for like the COVID era, and as we were scaling, it was sort of one of these guys where we were both like, some of our properties, we had 100% of the people leave and we had to release the whole community and build the community again. I mean, we would put a lot of upfront effort into facilitating house meetings, creating a food program, getting people to know how to collaborate, make decisions together, teach them conflict resolution culture and stuff like that. And so to kind of relaunch and re-onboard a whole community and create a whole system again. So that's on the operation side. But on the capital side, there are other co-living companies that, didn't weather the storm through COVID as well as we did. And some of them, pretty much every American co-living company.
Most of them.
Yeah. That other than us, died during COVID or even beforehand. And, a lot of these were venture backed. And so they were doing marginal deals. They would take projects that we wouldn't take. I mean, I remember very specific properties where we were both looking at it and we were like, that's not a good deal. Like this is a bad project. It's too expensive. It's not a good location. The design isn't good. And the other companies were like, hey, we need to grow fast. We're going to just kind of take everything. And so they had a bunch of deals.
And we have put $30 million in the bank to like take that risk, right?
Yeah, and they're taking master lease risk on it. So when the house of cards starts falling, it falls hard, because now not only are you not getting revenue, you're actually losing money on properties through master leases, and then spending a lot of money trying to lease them back up again. So, and a lot of them had shifted over to property management as they grew up and realized that was the structure they needed to use. But so that was bad optics in the capital markets when you're trying to raise money for a concept that's still basically nascent. This is not a mature asset class in real estate. This is a new idea. And from the venture perspective, they're like, 5 companies have failed at this thing, and it's not tech. We're like a little unclear whether this is really a scalable unicorn, type of prospect. I think, the VC style investors kind of back out, but we were never really even looking for VC. We're really looking at real estate, private equity. And they were looking at the deals that these other venture-backed co-living companies were operating and saying, they're losing money on rents. They're not operating these properties profitable. I don't like the vacancy rates. I don't like the operating expenses that they have on these real estate deals. And so we had to swim upstream and say, not only are we not venture backed and like we're much more grounded and like operationally rigorous, and we're not losing as much money operating these properties, but all of our deals are also like more viable, and they weren't all perfect, but we pretty much, I don't know if maybe one or a few times we had real estate deals that were cash flow negative, but only for a month or two at a time. For the most part, we kept everything at least break even. And, I don't know. I don't want to make up numbers, but a vast majority of the time, our real estate projects were cash flow positive. And I would say, at least 75% of the time we were hitting targets. And including COVID was the blip in that, but that's like across all time for 10 years. Probably better than that if you don't, way better than that if you don't include COVID. We're basically hitting targets like 98% of the time. So it was just a bad look to try to raise money for a communal housing concept during a time when people are like trying to shelter in place and quarantine away from each other, even though the resident experience was actually really positive. And people were like, oh, this is great. Let's shelter in place with 10 people who are in our little pod together, and we get to have social connection and co-work while we're working from home and make dinners and meals every night and have our little like micro events as a community. It didn't work out from a real estate investment perspective. And I would say the other aspect of that is that we were, I guess about 7 years in as the pandemic was starting. And so we were at enough scale where, Ben and I were like, hey, this is 7 years in. And if we're going to do this, we can't do this one project at a time model anymore. Like, we need to build a platform that can grow and is, the next phase of the company. And we're not always scrambling and scrapping together projects like $100,000 at a time. We need to raise a real estate fund to finance a portfolio of projects that we're going to invest in and develop. And so we partnered with 3 guys with a lot more real estate experience and real estate investment experience than ourselves, and worked full time on raising capital and turned over every stone and talked to lots and lots and lots of investors, both family offices and private equity firms. And, there were some moderate positive conversations for sure. And a lot of people got really into the concept, but it was all like, guys, this is a bad time. Like, it's hard to make even normal real estate projects pencil, let alone, innovative, leading edge kinds of projects in a pandemic when that model doesn't really sound like it's a little, not tone deaf, but like it sounds off. So.
Let's go kind of to Ben, what you were kind of alluding to, just kind of some of those lessons around facilitating community and culture and kind of the bit like, some of the takeaways here. I mean, you have this, some of them have been shared throughout the interview, but just kind of more than most people have had a real insight into what it looks like to build community from like the ground up. And I think especially in today's world, post-pandemic, if you want to call it, but rising rates of loneliness. Loneliness is an epidemic in the United States. Was so prior to 2020. Actually, it's only gotten worse. 2/3 of Americans are lonely, especially young people and parents. And this whole shift to the, technology being such a part of how we work and live, and AI and ChatGPT, like, what did you learn about community? I think that has so many impacts, is so relevant to just kind of how we all live today and how we're going to be living in the next decades to come, hopefully, at least.
Yeah. OpenDoor is a fascinating case study in this because, I think early on we really believed in the potency of a living community, not like a housing community, right? There's all sorts of communities. We have our work community, and your soccer community, or whatever. There's you have community around certain things. But early on, we believed deeply in the premise of living together with people, the potency and power of that in terms of all the ways that you grow personally, kind of being in such close proximity, the connections you make. I mean, that was very fundamental to our sort of impact thesis at the human level. That what better way is there to kind of grow and transform and become the greatest version of ourselves than to surround ourselves with other people who inspire us and have so many things also come from our networks, right? So like people who can, I have this project I'm working on, I need this thing. Suddenly there's 10, 15 people that are right there that, might know someone and are invested in you. So I believe in that more than ever. And then there was a lot of learning around how is that scalable? Can that idea be scaled? I mean, that was, again, going back to kind of like ground zero for us, like that was the vision. We saw something of intrinsic value and good. How do we make more of this in the world? That was what we were trying to do. And so one of the ways I think about what we did or what we were trying to do was it was a kind of community and cultural model housed in a real estate business model that we were trying to grow that culture, that vision through a real estate. That was where the money came from, because we didn't know how else to do it. Like that seemed like the most effective way to scale it. But through that process, there's a lot of ways we bumped up into constraints in the real estate industry, many of which we've touched on. But one thing I want to touch on that became, I think it's probably at the community curation side of things, is the single biggest structural barrier, distinct from maybe kind of some of the real estate funding and business model barriers, but that is tenant laws. That is, and this is probably not obvious to you until you start thinking about it or you've lived in one of our communities, but particularly in the West Coast and all the markets that we were in, there is very strong tenant protections that come from a really good place of protecting people's housing. But it's very much an individualistic model of this individual has a right to housing. There's, in the pandemic, that also got taken to extreme where there's eviction moratoriums, where like literally we had people, in fact, we have people, I should say have, because they're not ours anymore. There's people that up until we shut down the company hadn't paid rent for over a year. People that more than $10,000 unpaid rent that were still allowed to live there, and we're essentially taking advantage of that, that moratorium. So in the case of co-living and community, there are times when, for the health of the community, you need to get rid of a resident, a member of that community. Many of our communities came across that. It is just a reality, whether it's they're just not a good match, but in many cases, there's people who were toxic and dangerous to the community, either emotionally or physically in a few cases. Fortunately, no like major incidents, but certainly ones that I wouldn't want to have been living there when they happened. And in other communities, I don't know, if your group of friends, someone is an asshole, you kick them out of your friend group, it's like that simple. Or I don't know, maybe you're some sort of, I can only think of very like kind of like white collar examples, but you're in a tennis club and someone's a bad actor, you just kick them out of your tennis club. Like that's the end of it. We did not ever have that option, and it really hurt our communities. It really hurt us. And while this is the exception, not the norm, there are cases where there was someone who they knew their rights, and the community, like everyone wanted them gone. We even had some formalities around conflict resolution processes and sort of signing a vote of no confidence and things we put in place to basically put social pressure to say like, hey, this isn't working. We'd like you to leave. In cases we said, hey, we will literally pay you money to leave because this is so toxic. And so I would say that's like one of the big, if I had a magic wand and I could make co-living more viable in the world, I would say that there would be some sort of evolution to tenant protections that for a community environment where there's something called either goodwill or social capital or sort of a shared good, that has to take priority over the individual good in certain cases. And I think if that was in place, you'd be able to avoid, I would say 99% of issues at the community level. Said another way, if there's no threat, if there's no threat of there's no stick called you can be kicked out, then there's no lever for good behavior. And I think by and large, people came in with good intention and did the right thing because they wanted to, but there's some stat, I think it's like 1% of humanity is like psychopaths, something like that. There's like a certain number of people that like not like serial killers, but like don't have empathy for other humans, don't operate under normal kind of social social cues, social incentives. So that's one of the kind of like hard fought, like not something I would have said when I was trying to raise money, thing coming out of OpenDoor. So
the reality of community. It's actually something that everyone that has ever been a part of a community, certainly that has led or managed a community, will say that those situations, though rare, can really, really have an adverse impact on the community.
It does. Yeah. I mean, and like Ben said, there's sort of a regulatory mismatch because, housing law isn't designed for this like niche co-living experience, but there's sort of the back end of needing to be able to like ask someone to leave and be able to enforce that. And there could be a formal process, like literally even having 100% of everyone voting, and it needs to be 100% consensus. That would be helpful. We've even had moments where we did that and the person still wouldn't leave. But also the front end, there's for good reason, again, like, you can't discriminate based on someone's personality, whether or not they should live in a place or not. And that doesn't really account for the fact that there's other people living with that person. There's one little case law thing in California, I think it was down in Santa Barbara, where there was a case that was one where they said, we have a right to privacy and free association. We get to choose who we live with and who we associate with. And if we don't want to associate with someone, that's a privacy violation. But it's like a tiny case law thing. And, you don't want something to escalate to the point where you have to go to court. It's incredibly expensive to like defend and like create new case law on something. And we're a small company that doesn't have like $1 million legal budget. So that's the other thing that would be needed, I think, for co-living to really work like legally or in terms of a regulatory framework. But on the positive end, we're talking about like how when things don't work well, when you have like usually bad actors or people who are just a bad fit, when it does work, it's an incredible thing. And to some degree, there's a positive reinforcing, feedback loop of, positive energy and good rapport and good relationships and healthy interactions and healthy communication, creates a positive, momentum that community, strengthens over time. And I think the three of us experienced living together in Euclid Manor, that, even people who I would say are a bad fit, but they're maybe don't have a lot of experience in relationships, or maybe they're younger, or like people have different social, emotional intelligences and stances, where I know I've been a jerk in community before, and had to like, talk to somebody and be like, oh yeah, sorry. I hadn't had my coffee yet. And I was kind of like, had a bad day. I apologize. We're all human and we all have bad days, but it's being able to have that conversation and clear things up, that as that culture builds over time in a community, it almost heals itself, or new people come in, and rather than the status quo going to the lowest common denominator, in a healthy community, the status quo goes to the highest common denominator. And that's something that I really believe in. I still really believe in. And that's the power of community, and that's the beauty of community. And I do think that we live in an individualistic society that has sort of lost our social skills to some degree. And, if we'd all grown up in tighter knit groups and tribes and villages and smaller rural towns where it really matters, you can't be a jerk to that person because they're 1/20th of your community. And like, you don't want to have bad blood with your neighbors who are also your second cousins or whatever it is. So, I think that we all have to learn these community skills and more. And a lot of our residents that ended up being incredible positive contributors to the communities, definitely brought a higher degree of social emotional intelligence. And, over time that ripples out and people model after each other and learn how to resolve conflict and, sort of apologize early and often and assume good intent and do things not just for their own needs, but for other people's needs, and these sort of positive social, behaviors that you see over time.
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask this kind of maybe seems like you maybe answered the question, Jay, but kind of what are you both each most proud of when you look back and think about OpenDoor and the last 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, many of our strongest communities live on. So at a very real level, there are communities that exist now that would not have existed without us. At the same time, I don't take credit for all that they are. We maybe were the initial kernel, and then other people jumped in and made it their own. At this point, can't take any credit because they're perpetuating in their own virtuous cycle of of creating community. So I think at a very real level of that, I think probably the thing I'm most proud of is even though like we don't exist anymore, even though the industry I think is having a major hiccup, I think we showed what's possible. I think we created. I am clear that what we did was sort of breaking ground for the rest of the industry to come up around us. We were essentially, along with Campus, one of the first two co-living companies. I think through all the press we got, really popularized the concept in a way that others didn't. And I think that's here to stay. I think you don't need co-living companies to have co-living scale. There's a lot that can be done informally through people coming together in houses. I do think you need to be building more product designed for this lifestyle, but there's a lot that can go on without it. So I think, I'll never know for sure, that there'll be a legacy there around, modern forms of community housing being a part of our world. And I think that on the next real estate cycle, real estate's very cyclical. When things are good, there's a lot more kind of bright-eyed, bushy-tailedness, and then when things are bad, people pull back real quickly. So it'll be interesting to see in the next real estate cycle, as capital is hopefully abundant again, what happens there and what versions of co-living come into being at that point. And maybe probably won't even be called co-living. Will be whatever Gen Z wants it to be. I'm proud of that. And then I would also just say personally, I'm incredibly proud of, well, first of all, Jay and mine's collaboration and partnership, and us going for something, like swinging for the fences on something that ultimately we just deeply believed in. This was the business strategy and kind of business case really was secondary. We didn't do this because we saw a way to make money, and we didn't make money, but we saw this as a way to create something in the world we truly believed in. And I've never felt such a greater sense of purpose and inspiration as I did, particularly in the first 3-4 years of getting this thing off the ground. It was just a total joy. And probably has ruined me for life, because now I know what that feels like. So everything else will feel pale in comparison until I kind of,
good point.
Strike that chord again. So,
yeah. Yeah, I align with all of that. So I'm definitely feel proud and grateful for all of those things. You learned a ton about real estate, learned a ton about community, learned a ton about myself, learned a ton about operations, learned a ton about finance. It's kind of absurd. It's like 6 graduate degrees all in one. It's like 100% practicum. So very grateful for all of that. I feel like a different person 3 times over, personally. And I would say, like, the thing that I'm probably emotionally the most proud of, I said this when I was moving out of Euclid Manor. I lived there for 5.5 years, I think. It's the house the 3 of us all lived in together in Oakland. I would say emotionally, the thing I'm most proud of is just that community is still strong, and all of the moments of friendship and joy and incredible parties and dinners and, you know, relationships that were formed. And I know at least one marriage with kids that came out of meeting at Euclid Manor. I'm sure there's other people who met their partner there. Lots of new friendships made. I mean, I was there last night and still like connecting with people. And I think the community there is an example. And I think other communities of ours that were very healthy are bigger than just the people who live there and are points of intersection for a broader group of people that get to gue in this physical spaces and sort of tighten the weaving of a broader community. And so I feel like we've been a part of supporting probably thousands of people. I mean, we've had, I don't know if actually off the top of my head, but I think we probably had about 1,000 residents, if not more. And, you know, probably 5 times that in terms of regular visitors and extended community members. So I definitely have had a couple of former residents reach out and say, like, I just want to let you know that, like, this is like bigger than you realize. And I think that was probably would have been nice to know like a couple of years ago when we were like going through it and, you know, didn't always get the positive feedback because you only hear like when things are going wrong. You don't hear, people don't think to like reach out to their landlord because they met a new friend in their house, but that's what we're doing it for. And that's what matters to us. So yeah.
When you both look back, you see Open Door as a great success in achieving the mission that it set out to.
%. I mean, it's helpful. This is kind of, you know, a little bit dark, but it's helpful that the industry as a whole isn't really working because it's sort of, I don't think it was us, you know, I mean, as Jay talked about, there's real headwinds in particularly real estate capital markets. And we didn't talk much about this, but after COVID sort of was waning and, you know, culturally and societally, interest rates started going up and, you know, that killed off not co-living, but all particularly residential real estate. So it's sort of like, I don't like that happened, but I feel like within the overall kind of boundary of what could have happened with co-living, I'm really proud of what we created. I feel like we did it with integrity. We did it with like true to our values. And certainly there's a dance along the way of, you know, sometimes trying to do, you know, get a deal done and maybe, you know, there's a few things you compromise on. Jay shared a lot about that. But at the end of the day, we stayed true to the vision. And we were trying to scale something that mattered, something that was standing for something. And that feels like a success. So yeah. It was a success. And then it was also a failure because, you know, it'd be even cooler if we were talking right now and we were, you know, 800 beds under management and, you know, we were 20 staff, but that's just, I mean, entrepreneurship is one big, gamble and experiment. And if you go into it with another frame of mind, I think you're going to be really disappointed. So. Yeah,
absolutely. And I also want to say, you know, Ben, like in the early days when we had like 1 or 2 properties and like everything sort of just still felt like an idea and we're like, yeah, one day we'll be doing like new construction. And it always felt like something way out in the distance and a little bit like, I don't know if we're like drinking our own Kool-Aid here a little bit. But we did it. Like, you know, by the end, we didn't really mention on this call, but like we had properties that were 78 units that were all micro apartments with common space and, you know, being in 3 different cities and, you know, multi-state operation, like we didn't create a national network, but yeah, we got pretty close and not all of our communities had incredibly deep, profound social webs, but I would say a large portion did. And I do think we created a ton of cultural value or like enabled a bunch of cultural value to be co-created by residents and other community members. And so, you know, everything dies at some point. And so I think 10 years is a good run. And, you know, we also wound down the company in a graceful way. You know, we didn't go bankrupt and we gave employees a good amount of notice that we're we were going to be shutting down. And, we gave property owners a good amount of notice that we needed to back out, and had time to hand off utility accounts and do the accounting for all these properties so that there was as smooth of a transition as possible. And we'll be giving a little bit of money back to investors that we had left over and that kind of thing. So I feel clean about how everything went down.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I can speak as a former resident of the Euclid Manor. I am very grateful to you both and the entire OpenDoor team community. I look back on those years. It was about 2 years for me. If not the happiest, some of the happiest moments of my life, and just in terms of being in that house and sharing dinners and Shabbats and Hanukkah parties and birthday parties and just moments talking with friends. And I will always look back at those moments as some of the fondest in my life. And when you don't have it, when you're on the other side of it, I think you realize a little bit about what you don't know what you got till it's gone. I'm sure anyone that's lived in an OpenDoor community or any co-living community, you appreciated the moment, but you really appreciate it a few years later when you're like, wow, that was pretty unique and special to have on any given evening 2 or 3 people to cook dinner with, or, you knew you were going to have a house dinner twice a week or once a week. There was always going to be someone to talk to, just someone around. That's not really how we, at least in the United States, generally are set up to live our lives, which I think is to the detriment of our society and our humanity. So I'm grateful to you both. And I really also just appreciate the way you talk about, scaling a business, but also, shutting it down gracefully. I think that's a fact of business. It's a fact of entrepreneurship. Most companies shut down or stop, and how you do that is really important. And the fact that you've done it gracefully and with intention, I think is quite noble and something to look up to. So I respect that. And what's next for you both? Curious. I know you kind of alluded to what's next a little bit for the OpenDoor properties, and people are still living there and the community lives on, but curious for you as individuals, what you're thinking and what's next before we wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's been nice. We're still doing a little bit of just like final, it's operationally shut down, but there's still a bit of work to kind of, file the final taxes and all that kind of administrative stuff. But it's been nice to have a couple months. I have two young daughters, to have a little bit more time with them. And after basically 10 years of being nose to the grindstone, to have a little bit of space to just reflect on life, reflect on myself. But where I'm finding energy right now, I mean, it's the same thread in the broadest sense of what brought me to OpenDoor and informed my career even before then, which is I want to be doing impact work. I'm seeing a lot of excitement around climate tech and sort of decarbonization. One of our hidden missions in OpenDoor, we weren't sort of front and center about sustainability, but it was actually a huge part of the impact that was intrinsic to the model, just densifying housing. I should mention, we did the first ever, and as far as I know, first only at this point, net zero energy co-living building, one of the ones we developed directly in West Oakland. So yeah, when we could, we went that route. But I feel a lot of urgency for that problem of how do we transition our society to being one that can kind of fit within the constraints of Mother Earth and actually be hopefully a regenerative presence. So that's where I'm putting some attention and looking for what's next. And yeah, we'll see what comes there.
Yeah. And Ben is an incredible person because he both has the sort of financial analytical chops at an incredibly high level, as well as the sort of creative, entrepreneurial, emotional intelligence, like team building skills to sort of make ideas come into reality. So I'm excited to see what you end up doing, Ben. And for myself, also, yeah, we're just taking a breather a little bit for a couple of months. I mean, sort of, things have slowed down in terms of how much work we have to do for OpenDoor. And then I'm doing a little bit of consulting in the same space, sort of co-living stuff, but specifically curious about like new ownership and investment models for community. So I'm both doing just like some independent snooping around and research, but also some like direct consulting on like how to figure out how to structure a property to be owned by the residents. And I think we're both open in the interim few months to doing consulting on co-living projects or co-living type stuff, or new school real estate in general. But yeah, we're just kind of both launching out into this exploration of what's next. And I think it's sort of cool to reinvent yourself a little bit. And so we'll see where we go. I mean, I'm also just inherently an entrepreneur, so it's hard not to be like, what's the next idea? Like, let's create a new company. But I also have maybe a little bit less risk tolerance personally, at least in the near term. And so definitely looking for a little bit of stability personally after having taken like 10 years of financial and entrepreneurial risk that, didn't turn into a huge financial exit. So, staying practical, but also staying kind of inspired. So.
Well, Jay Standish, Ben Provin, thanks so much for sharing the journey of OpenDoor Co-living, and we're excited to see what you all build next. And thank you for everything that you've done.
Thanks, Smiley.
Thanks, Smiley.
Appreciate your time.